everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tyler Curry. I'm a CTI analyst at Health ISAC, their Operations Center, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. Today's presentation will discuss how attackers are successful in ways to mitigate their approaches and leverage their needs against them. The health sector often faces a threat landscape that includes ransomware, persistent activity groups that evolve in sophistication, amongst many other things. Despite this, defenders have many advantages that often go unused, and threat actors have needs they must accomplish before they can complete their actions and objectives. So today, our attendees can expect to hear some great information on how to respond to these things. However, before we get into today's content, I want to go over a couple of brief notes here. Today's webinar will be recorded and played back available for those to play back. And also feel free to provide Q&A in the question section so that we can address those at the end of today's webinar. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to our speaker, Tim Crothers.
Well, thank you very much, Tyler, and welcome everybody who's here. I'm thrilled to get a chance to share some of this content with you all today. It's a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart as a lifelong defender. And, you know, I get a lot of opportunity to speak to a lot of peers and see a lot of programs out there. And this in particular is something that I don't see leveraged nearly as much as I think we should as an industry, and looking forward to unpacking that for you all. So we're going to start out. We've got a pretty straightforward agenda here. We're going to kind of lay out the case for how we win as defenders and turn the tables on the attackers is ultimately. And as part of that, right, we as defenders have something that I find is commonly overlooked, and that's what I call home field advantage. In other words, we have the opportunity to leverage the unique environment that is each of our organizations to good effect to help us better defend. And that's what we'll be focusing on today as we go in. So I want to start out with this topic called the defender's dilemma. I suspect all of you on here are familiar with this concept. It's been heavily popularized by a lot of our vendor marketing programs in the cybersecurity industry. And candidly, I couldn't disagree with this topic more, but let me unpack that as to why. So, of course, the defender's dilemma, as shown here, makes sense on paper, right? We as defenders have to get it right 100% of the time, whereas attackers just have to get it right once. And if that was really true, then we would, we would certainly be doomed to fail. But the reason why I disagree with that is taking much too shallow of a view of how breaches actually occur. So let me unpack that for you. So it's Monday morning, the blood level in my caffeine system is too high, and I click on a phish that I received. And of course, it's malicious. I've now got malware running on my laptop. That adversary, right, if we take the dim view that we've now had a breach, which a lot of the definition of breach in our marketplace is just that, then yes, the defender's dilemma is correct. But I would suggest that's not actually the breach, right? That adversary who sent that malicious software has some sort of an objective. My laptop is not the objective. My laptop is just the first step in that process, right? I'm simply a means to an end. In that instance, we have what I call a prevention failure, right? Our preventative controls, which should have stopped that malware, clearly didn't. We will always certainly have preventative failures. Adversaries are very, skilled at finding ways to get around our preventative controls. And of course, we live in a world where O-days will always be a thing. And given that's the case, there's always going to be prevention failures. But I would suggest that we as defenders should think about the breach and think about breach prevention, not in the stopping all of those prevention failures. Obviously, we want to stop as many as we can. but they have an objective, right? That objective is probably something like deploy our ransomware, steal our data and intellectual property, whatever that case may be. I would suggest that as defenders, when we reframe breach defense as preventing the adversary from successfully completing their mission, it really changes how we think about that. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So our the wonderful Calvio folks that do all of the marketing stuff were kind enough to provide us this graphic. You may recognize this as the variation on the old chutes and ladders game. Well, why is this relevant? Well, over here on the left, you see the MITRE ATT&CK framework tactics for all of the sorts of things that an attacker has to accomplish in order to complete whatever their successful mission is, right? To deploy that ransomware, to steal our data, probably both in many cases is the current. And why this is relevant is because think about any of the recent breaches in, whether it's healthcare or anything else. Once the details start coming, there's the initial prevention failure. We'll call that day zero, right? So now the clock is ticking. We now have an adversary who has access to our environment. Then some days later, 10, 11, 12 are pretty typical. The ransomware actually deploys and the data is stolen. Well, what that attacker is doing in that intervening 10, 11 days is moving around within the environment, escalating their privileges, doing defensive evasion, right? All of those sorts of things that are shown there on the left side that MITRE does a really good job of articulating for us, right? They're going through that to find where that data is, to figure out which are going to be the hosts that they want to deploy ransomware. How are they going to deploy ransomware in our environment, right? Can they get domain privileges so they can use a GPO or a scheduled job, for instance, on our hosts? Things like that are pretty typical ways that they go about it. Well, the reason why I would suggest this is super relevant for us as defenders to think about the entirety of the activity they've got to do is because if we disrupt in there at any point, let's say day 9, we realize that they're in our environment, we successfully identify which hosts that they have access to, which credentials they're using, and we eject them from the environment. That became a nothing burger, right? This is now not a reportable thing under most disclosure laws, et cetera. And we went from having potentially a very, very impactful breach to, like I said, a nothing burger, right? And so that's where I'm coming from when I say, hey, we as defenders have the ability to really leverage this environment in a way that helps us accomplish that. So let's start unpacking that. Well, think about things from the lens of the attacker. You're now trying to harm the organization you work for as one of those external attackers so that you can deploy ransomware. They have needs in order to accomplish their outcomes. They need connectivity, right? That's why we have firewalls and all of these sorts of things to try and limit and inhibit that connectivity. They need access or vulnerabilities, right? So they either need legitimate credentials that they can use to sign in and access our systems, or they need some level of vulnerabilities that give them the ability to access those without having those credentials. In the vast majority of breaches, they need both, and often will leverage both of those in order to accomplish that. And then, of course, they need the capability to carry out the attack. So again, this is a combination of things on the part of the attacker. A lot of the more sophisticated attackers nowadays use techniques we call living off the land, right? They will leverage our existing systems. Maybe we're running SCCM and they'll figure out credentials to access SCCM in order to be able to deploy the ransomware. they're looking for those accesses. A very popular target of theirs are things like help desk, right? So let's go back to my laptop example from earlier. The way that attacker is almost always going to proceed, and probably relevant for this conversation, just to give everyone some context. In my career, I've spent 2 tours of duty at Mandiant. I do think that's the appropriate term for time there. The first time I was on the front lines with the various breach investigative work and helping out organizations. The second time I went back was after SolarWinds as the Chief Information Security Officer for Mandiant, helping them defend themselves against the attackers. And so that plus several of my other career places has given me a lot of opportunity to observe this firsthand. So back to my laptop example. So now they're on my laptop. First thing that threat actors almost always going to do is establish persistence, right? They want to make sure that when I shut my laptop down or reboot or whatever, that they'll still be able to regain access to that laptop. Then the almost indefinitely, definitely the next thing they'll do is dump all of the locally cached credentials. So they'll dump out things like the tokens stored in our browser cache, the local memory cache, like on Windows, the LSAS cache, for instance. That gives them various accesses in order to be able to do lateral movement. Lateral movement, of course, is logging from my laptop to other systems within the environment. Because, of course, in my case, I've been an executive now, leading cybersecurity teams for years. So my laptop has very little useful on it. A lot of PowerPoint and Excel, and that's email. That's about it. I don't have administrative access to systems these days, et cetera, the sorts of level of access that we want. But what I might have done is I might have had a problem with my printer, or maybe my VPN wasn't working right. And so in most organizations, what do? I call the help desk. The help desk team remotes into my laptop in order to help me troubleshoot and diagnose this. Well, when they did that, of course, the help desk credentials were cached locally within my laptop. That's a huge popular target of the threat actors, because they know the help desk credentials are going to enable them. Lots of times they won't have deep administrative access, certainly to things like our domains, but they will have a lot of local administrative access, and importantly, very wide access in order to log into a lot of systems across the organization. And so they need those things in order to complete their objective. By us as defenders really having a crisp understanding of the attacker's needs, we can then turn and focus on those needs, right? By knowing that this is what they're going to be going for, that now gives us an opportunity to think about, all right, how do I use that in order to subvert their activity so that, as I said earlier, we can break that chain before they win. So this is where it gets to what I call the concept of a home field advantage. So in one of the things that I've been a proponent of using for 5+ years, since they first became really popular, starting to become popular as a concept, is what's called honey tokens and honey accounts. So knowing that the attackers are going to be going for our various credentials and going after those sorts of things, well, then we can use that against them, because they don't know what our environment normal should look like. They don't know which credentials are real and which aren't real. And if we seed our environment throughout with a bunch of these accounts that are indeed and simply just lures for the sake of the defenders knowing that we've got a problem, then we flip the table. We create what I like to call an attacker's dilemma, right? Again, let's look at that laptop. If they dump the creds on my laptop, they see that help desk account, And if we've done a good job as defenders on caching that in a way that looks completely legit, ideally using some systems that have maintained it, that make it, are using the same sort of naming scheme and other things that we use elsewhere in the organization, then the only way the attacker can know whether this is a legitimate credit or not is to try it. And so what this does is they log on, they move around. Ultimately, we just need them to hit one of those honey tokens, and we're off to the races and can now defend them. The beauty of this approach is that when we seed the environment, and this is, of course, a simplified diagram here, using tooling like that provided by Acalvio, for instance, we can actually seed this across the entirety of the organization so that all of these systems have it. Once they hit that, right, there's no legitimate reason for anybody business need wise within our organization to be dumping cache credentials. And if those are not indeed real credentials, but are instead just tripwires to alert us, then what we've got as defenders is a high fidelity indicator that we've got something malicious going on in that host environment. And indeed, the goal from my perspective with my teams at Mandiant, for instance, was to have this across all of the systems so that the likelihood that they selected one of these on the very first laptop that they hit, we drop an IPsec policy right on that laptop and contain it, and boom, the problem is solved. Um, you know, when I was CISO for Mandiant, my KPIs were number of prevention failures a quarter, containment time, i.e., from the point at which the initial prevention failure happened, what was the time at which we contained that, so on and so forth. Um, the beauty of that for defenders is when we put those kind of KPIs in front of our team and help them unpack those and understand that this is how we're going to be measuring success, they get really, really creative at building processes to do that effectively. A fun fact, my last report to the board of directors at Mandiant, just prior to the Google acquisition of Mandiant, was the team was down to 12 and a half minutes average containment time. And so what that creates for us as defenders is really a hostile environment for the attackers, right? Where they have a really tough time knowing how to proceed from host to host to host without hitting any of these tripwires in our environment. Now, there's some keys here to this, right? What we want to do is we want to do this in a way, of course, that's very, very low administrative burden, that is really easy, that looks exactly like. Obviously, we can talk about some of those sorts of things. And I kind of flew through this one a lot quicker than I expected. Tyler, do we have any questions yet? Anything folks would like me to go into more detail on?
Yeah, we have some questions that have come through, and I like to, remind those as we go through this segment. This is a great time to post any additional questions that you do have, so we can go ahead and get into those. So, one of the questions here is, you mentioned your experience with KPIs regarding responses to incidents, things like containing and all that good stuff. How do you have any recommendations on how teams can not fluently, but how teams can have or create KPIs that allow them to remain modular throughout the years, comparison to the past and the future, just basically remain flexible to the threat landscape and be able to basically have more up-to-date KPIs and allow themselves to be just fluent throughout the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned two of the KPIs. The other two KPIs I used at Mandiant, the third one was software defects, right? So Mandiant in that case produced, tooling for companies to defend. So one of my nightmare scenarios as CISO there was that Mandiant produced software that was supposed to help an organization be, defended against adversaries. And an adversary found an O-Day in that software and actually used that tool in order to execute their compromise. So software defects. And then the fourth one was what I call dynamic cyber defense. So let me unpack how I go about those. So let's pull back slightly. What's our job as cybersecurity teams? I would argue it's to prevent as much as we can, right? And when we don't successfully prevent, to mitigate it as quickly as we can, ideally before it turns into a breach. Obviously, in a lot of cases, if we're producing customer-facing software, then the quality of that software needs to be good, which is the software defects. And then the fourth one, the fourth thing we need to do as defenders is respond to changes in the risk landscape. So that's my fourth one, which is dynamic cyber defense. So think Log4j, right? CISA announces Log4j on that Friday morning. We were all safe, or we thought we were safe at least, as well as we knew. And then all of a sudden, we've got a new published impact. How quickly can we mitigate that? So dynamic cyber defense is simply a measurement of when the risk significantly changes, and it stops when we've mitigated it. Because we don't know what the next Log4j will be, but we know we will constantly have to do that. So building processes to go, oh, new risk. All right, red team, you need to go model this attack for us. So the defense team, we need detection for this. We need prevention for this, so on and so forth, right? Whatever those relevant components are. And so the reason I picked those KPIs is because I would argue that those are the outcomes we're trying to achieve in our overall defense of an organization, right? I had the good fortune of working for GE at one point in my career. And if you're familiar with GE, they're the home of Lean Six Sigma. And I just really fell in love with the power of process improvement for what we do in security, because really everything we do is a combination of people, process, and technology, right? And so by using, whether it's Lean Six Sigma or whatever, but some level of process improvement, what I often see go to the board as KPIs are things like, well, this is our EDR health percentage on our endpoints. Well, that's what I would consider the X side of the equation, right? It's not that it doesn't matter, but that's a knob that we as defenders dial in to do what? Well, to prevent malicious activity on that endpoint, right? And so by measuring the number of prevention failures, right, I can't easily measure prevention successes, but I can certainly pretty easily measure prevention failures. And so by measuring the failures that we've had in our preventive controls, one, I can build processes to go back and do that, but it also really is a measurement of one of the key outcomes that we're trying to drive. So that's why prevention failures, containment times, software defects, and dynamic cyber defense are kind of my personal preferred for KPIs. If you're not producing customer-facing software, then I would just drop that one. But the beauty of those KPIs is they're eternally relevant, right? Because they're focused on the outcomes that we're trying to accomplish. And then all of the other kind of sub KPIs like our threat actor stuff, et cetera, right? It's not that that isn't all relevant. That's hugely important, but that's really for us as practitioners to use to shape those outcomes. And what I found was boards are very responsive to those kind of outcomes. It really turned it into meaningful discussions like, hey, we had a spike in prevention failures this past quarter, right? Our average is 5 to 10 a quarter, and this past quarter we were 20 prevention failures. What was up with that? Well, there was an O-Day that was released on this, and it took the vendor a week to get patches out. And so in that intervening period, it was highly exploited against us. And The board, of course, is really just trying to assess, are we as security teams doing our jobs? And that really helps them to understand our outcomes in a way that's not technobabble, but is also very, very meaningful to help them assess how we're doing in those jobs.
Awesome. What kind of controls, in addition to honey tokens, do you need to reduce containment time from an IR perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that one actually is a lot. I'll hit it high level, and then if folks want me to dig in deeper, because we've got the time, I'm certainly happy to do so. So it starts with what we're sending to Glass in our SOC. And what I mean by that is what are the alerts that we're popping up in our SOC? When we start thinking about if our SOC's job is to know we've got prevention failures and then to contain them before the adversary has the ability to complete their mission, it really changes what we send, to alerts for our analysts to be focused on. When I look at the vast majority of SOCs today, what's going to Glass and alerting are attacks. Well, we don't actually care about attacks. We do, the Intel team cares about those, but I would, at least in my SOC functions, we focus on successful attacks, right? What are the attacks that worked, that got through our defensive measures? And that's a small percentage of that, which one means we've got a lot less noise going on. Two, it also changes our process for how we investigate. So when we typically do an incident response in an organization, we're focused on things like how did they get in and all of these sorts of things, right? How did they get in past that prevention failure? Well, when we're focused on containment as the initial, we're really looking for scope, i.e., what all systems do we have compromise on? What's the credentials that are compromised, right? How is that adversary accessing and leveraging our environment? And as soon as we've got that scope, we can move to containment, right? And we can move to, on laptops, we can pretty strongly contain. Obviously, on servers, we might have to do things like force resets on credentials that they're leveraging, other things like that, because obviously we typically can't just drop firewall rules on a server without bigger business impact potentially. But key being that we stop the access of the adversary to the environment. Well, now then, at that point, we can go back and get all the details like, well, how did they get in? What all did they touch? Did they get any data out? So on and so forth, right? Because now we're not under a time pressure. We've stemmed the bleed, so to speak. Think of it almost as, for those of us in healthcare, right? As a trauma response, right? Where, all right, what are the steps in the trauma that we've got to do? Well, we've got to stop any major bleeding and so on and so forth, right? Are they breathing? All of those, kind of key trauma response. Build your IR processes something like that, because then we can take all the time we need to do the full investigation and figure out what for future. And don't underestimate the value of the process in there, right? It's not just the technical tool, it's the skills of the folks, it's that they've got clarity on the processes. When I build a Fusion Center SOC program, I build in from day one what I like to call continuous improvement. Often most people would consider this purple teaming, but basically using the actual Lean Six Sigma process, we'll do a gauge where we test a particular type of attack sequence with a volunteer internally, land malware on that laptop with a red team, because that gives us the level of granularity on those timestamps to really truly find people, process, and technology issues to help us lean out that containment time.
Is it easy to enumerate honey tokens on an endpoint from the perspective of if if you're putting the same one or implementing the same one everywhere, do you have a strategy that you would recommend regarding this implementation of a honey token?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think there's a few keys here. One, they've got to be very realistic, right? They've got to look exactly like all of the rest of. Two, you want to do something well, let me back up and answer the strategy component first. The strategy is really pretty simple. We want to have pretty pervasive coverage of our environment, right? The more pervasive the coverage that we've got in our ecosystem, the more likely we are that they're going to hit one of them, right? So for me, that means I want one or two accounts on each host of these honey tokens, at least one. It really depends on my overall controls. So if, for instance, a lot of environments have a maximum local cache count of 2, for instance, on your laptops, if you're running Windows as an example. So if that's the case, then I'm going to just deploy one honey token, probably do a simulated help desk that looks like a help desk account, for instance. But I also want to attack things like browser caches, et cetera. And this is partly why I've become such a fan and an advisor for Calvio, because I've been doing these techniques a long time. They've, of course, bring some technology edge to this where they integrate with Defender and CrowdStrike and things like that to really allow that simplification for us in that pervasiveness. And so the key two things then tactically are, one, just that they are pervasive, but two, you don't want them to just be something you do once a year, right? The attackers are going to be intelligent, right? We want to assume that they're clever. And so if they dump it and that help desk is 9 months old, and looks like it's 9 months old was the last login date, and the other accounts are more fresh, right? Again, we want it to be kind of very dynamic so that it looks very, very realistic, like all of our other systems within the environment. I
Okay.
also wouldn't go for just accounts on the local, right? Go for all the other things that they target, right? Think Kubernetes, cache credentials, AWS secret keys on dev laptops, in GitHub, et cetera. Think of all of and again, MITRE has a lot of great wealth of information on where attackers go for a lot of this type of stuff. Leverage that as part of your larger strategy as well. Sorry, Tyler, didn't mean to cut you off, sir.
Oh, no, you're fine. What techniques might a hacker or a red team use to spot these traps and avoid them? And why don't they just avoid them?
Well, if we've done a good job on creating them very realistic, they really don't have an opportunity to do it, right? Where I see this fail in approach, maybe a better way to answer this question is I've seen people try this approach and fail, and it's because of two things when I dug in with them to see what was going on. One was they didn't look realistic for some reason, right? Whatever methodology they were using to deploy them left some clues in some sort that allowed a savvy attacker to differentiate the fake from the real stuff. Or two, they weren't attractive, right? Like if you're going for endpoints, right? Again, think about what the attacker's looking like. I wouldn't go for a domain admin on the local unless it's an actual domain administrator who would be pivoting to a domain admin account from his laptop, right? For something like that. So be really careful, because if it's too tempting and too obvious, that's going to set them off on the realism. But also, if it's just not interesting, it's just a normal user account that's also on, if on my laptop there's 5 end user accounts and that's all they are, they're probably just going to continue to try and use my cache credentials, for my account. That's the primary, to lateral to the, what they'll do is they'll dump the cache credentials. Let's say they see 5 local user accounts. They see that I'm running as Tim, right? and then they dump my session table, right? I.e., what network sessions do I have with other hosts within the environment? Well, it's a safe bet that Tim credentials work with those sessions because they're live for me. And so they can use those and then dump the process again, right? Rinse and repeat on that next host till they find something more intriguing. So again, let me boil that somewhat long-winded answer down. Not pervasive enough that they just don't simply see them, or two, they're not realistic enough. Those are where I see this approach fail.
All right. So do you rotate these accounts, these honeypot accounts after each incident, knowing the threat actors will return and would likely not use the same account a second time?
Absolutely. Yeah. As part of this, right? And this is where the tooling matters to make this super easy, because there's some great technology out there that just doesn't scale to medium and larger environments. And part of the reason also I should add why I'm such a keen proponent of this approach, especially in industries like healthcare, is because there's no overhead, right? It's just something that we're caching on the endpoint. So it's not another agent running. It's not another, potential thing. Because of course, in a lot of our healthcare environments, we've got not necessarily huge capabilities on CPU and memory and disk and et cetera, right? Um, but yes, I would suggest you want to be rotating this on a regular basis, even if the adversaries aren't accessing one of these. But certainly, if they are, I would flip it.
Awesome. So in the terms of ransomware baits or honeypots, it's not recommended in disk encrypted environments, as they may generate many false positives. Is there any reliable way to deploy ransomware baits when disk encryption is in use, because they trigger alerts when encryption starts?
Not that I know of. I wouldn't personally recommend going that route, not just for the reasons, but also realize that, you know, usually there's two levels of actors that we're going to be dealing with on the ransomware front. One is a full scope actor, right, who's doing the entirety. It's most common, though, today that we've got initial access brokers and then the ransomware affiliate. And so, what I mean by that is the initial access broker, that's a group of folks that all they're trying to do is get that initial access, get that persistence, get some of those initial credentials, and then they sell those off um, to the ransomware affiliates. The ransomware affiliates are the people who are actually going to deploy the ransomware and try and hold us captive. So if they're in the initial access broker group, they're not interested in ransomware, so that's not going to be attractive to them. If they're an affiliate, they're coming with their own ransomware to deploy. So again, they're not really looking for other interesting ransomware in that case.
Okay. So we hear, about major successful breaches about every other week. As of the latest, Jaguar, Land Rover, etc. Do you have any insight or a thought on, why the CISOs may not have deployed deception at scale before they were breached?
Yeah.
And second part to that question, and I can repeat if you need me to. Do you think they may have? Do you think that their preventative controls like EDR would have prevented the breach?
Yeah. So the first one's super easy. It's in my experience a lack of awareness, right? That's why I like doing things like this webinar to help get the word out. You know, when most people think deception, they're thinking about honey pots, not honey tokens. Honey tokens are a much more newer, kind of approach on this. And I find there's a significant lack of awareness about how powerful this honey token approach. I'm not certainly saying that honey pots don't have some value, but that's for very different use cases and purposes. Honey tokens in particular are an early warning system, a detection mechanism that is high fidelity in an environment that allows us to turn that environment against the attacker. So the answer to that first part of the question is lack of awareness. The second piece is an interesting question, right? If we go back to, let me cycle back here to that good old chutes and ladders slide here, right? One more. There we go. So if we shoot back to this slide and we really think about the breach unfolding, one of the ways that I spot a vendor who doesn't understand how attackers work and how a real breach works is those vendors that I'm sure you've all encountered that go, oh, well, if company X had only had our tech, that breach would have been prevented. It is never that simple to answer that question, because while we've portrayed this in a fun way here as a chutes and ladders, what is really occurring here is this adversary is working past all of the preventative controls that this organization has, right? They're running into roadblocks and hitting things and going, oh, I couldn't run Mimikatz because their CrowdStrike implementation successfully detected it. And then they're going to remain quiet for a little bit to see if the security team realized that they've got an active incursion going on. And there's this real cat and mouse thing that's going on. But the bottom line being, the reason why it's 10 to 12 days typical between the initial start here and successful completion is because that adversary has to work past all of the preventative controls in the organization. Couple that with, if you look at your detective controls, i.e. what are you're alerting on, most of it is aimed at detecting this initial foothold. Most organizations have very poor coverage when you actually dig into the detection for lateral movement, for things like that. Because remember, in most cases, this adversary is either using some vulnerabilities to escalate privileges and other things that are functioning, ergo, our tooling doesn't know about the vulnerability and have the ability to block it, or two, they're moving around using legitimate creds within the organization because they're capturing and scraping them out of our hosts, right? And so our ability as defenders to differentiate legitimate use of those creds versus illegitimate use of those creds is pretty thin, and so that's what creates this environment where the attacker has some time to move around within these environments. The details are different on every single breach. What I would say is a couple things there. One, take whatever is reported in the media with a grain of salt. So I've personally had well over a couple hundred breaches that I've worked end up, being reported on. Not least of which Target's breach. I joined Target in 2014 to rebuild after their famous breach in 2013. None of the public information on how that breach played out is accurate. There's bits and pieces of accuracy, et cetera. And so you want to think about it from more that MITRE level. What are the activities that they have to accomplish? What are the needs of the attackers? Focusing on those, I would suggest as a defender, certainly understanding TTPs of our threat actors, understanding, I would suggest, and it's kind of outside the scope of this particular webinar, but a really healthy, strong defense program starts with cyber threat intel and understanding what the threat actors are doing, who they are, what are their TTPs, et cetera. Because I would suggest we as defenders, the art in what we do is having the right controls in the right place at the right time. And of course, intel helps lead that. Not sure if I totally got the last half of that question. Hopefully that did. If not, ask some follow-up, please. Happy to try to unpack more.
Absolutely. Given that phishing and compromised tokens bypass traditional perimeter security, what is the single most effective technical control beyond basic MFA that organizations can deploy to prevent initial access via compromised identity?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I would say there is think of MFA broadly, right? Like so MFA is more of a class of things. And so it's less a technical control and more of a process in terms of the question. Technically speaking, from a control perspective, we have single factor and we have multi-factor, and that's our authentication, right? Technically, like our fingerprint and the various biometric things like retina or whatever, those are just examples of additional factors, hence multi-factor. So I would suggest think about it from a perspective of your implementation of MFA, i.e., what are your multiple factors and how can those be bypassed? Let's take a good example that's relevant right now, scattered spider, right? One of scattered spider's techniques is they pretend to be you as a user, they call into the help desk, they get their mobile device added to your multi-factor. So now their mobile number will receive. Of course, they do lots of other things as well. But in my experience, there, the SIM swapping and those techniques are less common, certainly relevant. Certainly, we've got to be aware of them, but frankly, less common because they're much more difficult for them to pull off. Um, Much easier, for instance, I had a case earlier this year where it wasn't scattered spider, but someone using similar techniques. They called this organization's HR help desk and said, "Hey, I'm executive so and so. I need my employee ID. I forgot my employee ID." And so of course the HR help desk said, "Well, what's your social security number, etc." They had that data. The threat actor had the full SOC, unfortunately, on that particular executive, and they were given successfully authenticated and were given the employee ID. Then they turned around and called the IT help desk, provided the employee ID and the other information, got them to not just reset the password on their account, but also reset the MFA on the account so that they could MFA. And so it's not a different technical control in context of that, but think about, well, how do we authenticate those folks that are coming in, right? That's, I would suggest, just a process change. If they're calling in the help desk, hey, can they get on video, show your driver's license, things like that, so that we inhibit the threat actor's ability to subvert our existing MFA. Think about our MFA. Are we using pushes, right? This is where, again, the intel becomes very relevant, right? We've got the technique that basically push bombs our employees, right, with the MFA, acknowledgement on the phone, and eventually they go yes, just because they want to quit be bothered, right? So should we be using push MFA technique? And so I would change it to the thought process there for that question to really focus on examination of existing MFA approach or approaches, as the case may be, and how can we harden those to make that MFA more resilient, whatever those multi-factors are.
Awesome. Since C2 traffic and scheduled tasks are attacker necessities, how can the blue team use automated threat hunting to detect the establishment of persistent backdoor or proxy before C2 communications initiate?
Yeah, that's a great question. By all means, I think the question is completely accurate. any of the attacker's core techniques, you should, one, be threat hunting for those techniques. But I would even try and turn that into real-time detection, right? So I tend to use threat hunting on my teams as a way to really validate particular use cases. And then the next step is, how can we turn this into real-time detection, right? If we're using, CrowdStrike or something like that on the endpoint, can we write a custom rule that sends an alert every time there's a new scheduled task created, and then build some, mechanisms around that to filter out all of the noise associated with legitimate business activity around that versus new activity around that.
Someone is at the front door.
Awesome. See if we have any other questions here. I know you mentioned a couple of things that help desk can do regarding verifying identity and things of that nature, but how can organizations better prepare the help desk or customer-facing teams for tactics from, the scatter spiders of the world, like social engineering tactics, and basically become less of a soft target?
Yeah, that's a great question. The good news is there's a ton of great material on that out there. Almost all of the Intel providers have a lot of great, kind of training and help material. Certainly, in my experience, all of the cybersecurity training program folks have a lot of good material on it as well. But this is also a good opportunity to really look at your processes and really build, some hardening into that process, some additional verification mechanisms. And some of it might be as simple as things like you automatically text a user on their registered cell phone number anytime a password change is requested by the help desk, and ask them to respond, was this you or not, right? We can really do a lot of things where we leverage the help of our larger organization without ideally introducing a bunch of burden certainly on our users, right? And I think there's a lot of ways to really get creative, because the good news is the scattered spiders and such of the world, they're talented, no question about it, but they're not magic, right? They still need to trick our help desk folks or whoever it is they're targeting. Certainly that's their most common target. And so by really helping equip and we can have some fun with it. I'm a big believer in let's have some fun and create a monthly prize for the help desk employees who catch the most social engineering, and then harness our red team to go add some into the mix, right? To help them with that training. It doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be difficult. We can do some employee recognition for the folks who are doing the right thing. I've worked for a lot of small organizations without big budgets over the course of my career, in addition, of course, to the very, very large ones I've also gotten to work for. And I think it's more about the skill and understanding of our folks in many cases than it is about some fancy cybersecurity widget solving the problems for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely agree with that sentiment of the internal, bounty hunting type of initiatives in amongst your organization. You can get that internal buy-in aside from your typical quarterly or monthly cybersecurity training. Kind of get that buy-in from that personnel. But not seeing any further questions in the queue here, and I see we have about 5 minutes left here. So, Tim, I'd like to thank you for coming through and presenting and speaking with our audience today on behalf of Akivia, and for our attendees for joining. Thank you for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.